Hello everyone, and welcome to yet another bake along where we just relax and bake the time it takes. And today's recipe is a perfect comfort bake. I am making my Farmhouse Oat bread. Now, this loaf of bread is something that you can make same day. So it's not a sourdough or uses a starter. You can be slicing into this bread 3.5 hours from when you first start making it. But I will walk you through the steps. When it comes to making bread, there aren't a lot of active steps to it. Kneading is the most active. There's a lot of passive time. So have your stopwatch or timer ready in order to get going. Now, this loaf of bread involves a number of whole grains. First, I'm relying on oats, and then I'm using whole wheat flour. Now, I'm using whole rolled oats here, and I like using not the quick cook or the instant, but the regular, because timing the hydration when you soak the oats and how your bread absorbs the water is very important. So I like to use rolled oats. So I've got my full amount of rolled oats measured here and 2/3 of a cup of my whole wheat flour. And what I'm going to do is soak this first. So this will plump up the oats. I've got some freshly boiled hot water. Don't worry, I'm not adding the yeast to this at this point. So in goes my hot water. And you want to give this just a stir to combine everything. And it's going to look like stodgy porridge. It's amazing how the oats absorb that water so quickly. But at the same time, that bit of whole wheat flour inside this porridge is hydrating, and what's happening is the protein strands within that flour through the hot water and time are going to bond together, and that's going to build some structure into this bread. I'm using oats, which are naturally gluten-free. I've got whole wheat flour. I will be adding some bread flour later, but any opportunity to build that strength, especially because I'm not taking 3 days to make this bread, which time also helps promote that bonding of the protein that holds in the yeast when this bread ferments. So this mixture is too hot to use right now, even though the room temperature oats and whole wheat flour cool down the boiling water a little bit. It's not enough for me to start working with the dough right now. It's too hot. So give this about 20 minutes to cool down. The key thing you need to remember is that yeast thrives at just above body temperature. So anything above 98 degrees Fahrenheit up to 120 Fahrenheit. Once you start pushing more to 130, that's when you risk actually killing the yeast. Even though commercial yeast these days is pretty hard to destroy, temperature is your friend and also your enemy at the same time when it comes to baking bread. So we didn't have to wait for 20 minutes. And if you're baking along with me, and I highly encourage you doing that with this recipe, every time I hit a pause for time, you hit pause on the video, and then you pick it up after that time has lapsed. So after 20 minutes, you can see nothing has really changed, but the whole wheat flour has absorbed the water, and now I have a mixture that is really I can feel it's just above body temperature. So it's probably about 105, 110 degrees. So what I'm going to do is take this mess, goopy, gloppy, heavy mess, add it to my big mixing bowl, and now add my remaining dough ingredients. I am using bread flour here, which has a higher protein content, because it's balancing out the fact that I have no protein, or gluten, I should say. There is protein in oats, but not the gluten protein in the oats. So I'm trying to build some structure while I can. I do have some additional whole wheat flour, but I'm going to hold on to this to add it as I'm kneading the dough, and you'll see why. Additional liquid, I'm adding a bit of milk. Room temperature is ideal now that I've controlled the temperature of my oats. I don't recommend, I remember one time adding cold milk to my hot porridge mixture thinking that would even out, and it was still just a bit hot. So it's better, keep everything at room temperature or slightly higher, and then you're fine. I've got my instant yeast, which means I don't have to dissolve it in my milk, but it can just be added to the bowl. A little bit of vegetable oil. My sea salt, and I'm just, out of habit, I put it on the opposite side of the bowl where I add my yeast, just so there's no direct contact. And just a touch of honey. Gives the yeast a little something to snack on while it's rising. It doesn't really add a whole lot of sweetness, so if you want to leave it out, you can, but I just like that accent. This is really a rustic style of bread. That's why I call it my farmhouse loaf. It's meant to be sliced and slathered with butter and jam on it. Okay, so I'm going to stir this. You can use a mixer, of course, to make this dough, but just so you get a sense of the texture as you're working the dough by hand and how it handles, that's how I wanted to mix it, exactly by hand. So you stir it in the bowl until it becomes a little too hard to manage and you don't see any large ribbons of flour in there. So it's very sticky, and I'll move my mat out of the way. And this is, whenever I'm mixing a dough by hand, I like to measure all my flour out, but I hold back some because it's easier to manage and work it in as you're kneading the dough. Because if you add it all at once to your dough before you even start kneading it, it will be dense and hard and a bit hard to manage, where now, while it starts off sticky, at any possible opportunity, I can sprinkle flour knowing that I'm not adding too much flour to the recipe, which is very, very important. All right, if you've got one of these handy tools, this is a bench scraper or a bowl scraper, either will work. And now I'm going to start kneading my dough, and anytime I find it starts getting sticky, I can feel it, you just sprinkle more of that flour. And ultimately, by the time I'm done kneading the dough, all of this measured whole wheat flour will be incorporated, and I know I haven't added too much. As a new baker, that's always the temptation, to add more flour. The dough's too sticky, I need to add more flour. Well, then you end up with a bread dough that doesn't rise in the oven because it's got so much flour, it has no room or space to grow at all. And the kneading action, I should explain this, I'm doing it without even thinking. When you're kneading your dough, if you're new to making bread, you push it away from you, bring it towards you so you're folding it, and then you rotate 90 degrees. And you keep this motion. It's very therapeutic. And you want to give yourself about 5 to 7 minutes with this process. If you're using a mixer, it takes a little bit less. But you can feel the dough changing. This is why it's fun to make dough by hand. You can feel the dough changing under your hand as you're exercising it. So it's just getting a little bit tacky now, so I'll add a bit more flour. Your ambient humidity, the amount of moisture in the air, inside and out, can impact how much flour or that your bread absorbs. If it's a hot, humid day, there's already moisture in the flour or moisture in the air, but your flour holds moisture too. So on a humid day, you may find you need to add extra flour because there's just so much moisture. And on a dry winter's day, well, just like our skin and our hair and our nails, your flour dries out a little bit and you may need to add either less flour to the recipe or a little more moisture. So that's why you see a lot of dough recipes call for that variation, or at least be aware of it. I can add definitely some more as I work along here. There we go. I think I don't need to add any more flour. I'm just gonna make sure my dough is, just really keep working it in until it is no longer sticky to touch. There, see how it's cleaning my work surface? So I know the flour has been worked in, but it's not sticky or gluey to my hands at all, so I can stop. A little sprinkle so it's easy to handle. And this is the point with this dough where you wait to let it rise 90 minutes. So you want to put it in a bowl. I prefer a clean bowl. You don't have to grease or oil your bowl. And here I have one that I made an hour and a half ago. Oh, when you unwrap a bowl with bread and that aroma of the fermenting dough is, oh, it's such a delicious smell. So don't be afraid when you tip out, and I'll use that whole wheat flour I have left, that dough out, that your bread dough starts to deflate. So we're not ready to go to the oven yet. I'm gonna make use of this bowl, pop my new dough in there, and set it aside for 90 minutes. So you'll notice I tipped the dough out so that the bottom, the stickier part, is now facing up. So now I'm building a bottom and a top to my dough. So this side has flour on it. I don't want to add flour to my top surface because now I'm going to punch down the dough as I shape it into a round. Now this makes a very large loaf of bread, so I'll leave it up to you. You have the option of dividing it in two and doing two smaller loaves of bread if you want. I'm gonna go for the big one here. And so you flatten out the dough a little bit and then reshape it into a ball. But you bring in all these sort of end pieces into one place, right in the center here. And this is going to be the bottom of your loaf of bread. Then you flip it over. And now what you want to try and do, and this takes a little practice, is develop a tautness, almost like a skin without a skin, on the top of the bread. And this helps it hold the round shape. If you don't do this step of tucking in the dough evenly, you may end up with a loaf that once it bakes kind of pops out at one side or the other unevenly. So this final step of spinning the dough and then tucking it, and I don't know if we can zoom in on this. As you're spinning the dough, I'm using the heel of my hand, and you actually don't want a heavily floured surface at this point. And as I rotate, I'm pulling the dough and it's kind of stretching on the top and underside and then tucking itself in the bottom. And it's tightening up the bread, so now it's going to hold its shape well as it rises. See how it's sitting upright? It's not flat as when I first tipped it out. That's when I know I'm done my shaping. So this is ready to proof again. I have one already proofed. So this loaf of bread, after 30 minutes, now that we've shaped it, is going to look like this. So let me just carefully, now we don't want to tear the dough down. And I'll put this, yes, you want a little piece of parchment paper, just slightly bigger than the loaf itself. Set it on top like so. Rewrap the bread. I've got a tea towel and a bit of plastic. You can double tea towel if you want, but you're trying to keep all the moisture in. So let me set this aside and give my hands a little clean. I've got a nice film of dough on them. And I'm not kneading dough anymore. All right, now for the next step. When it's time to shape your dough, so after the 90 minutes of the first rise, that means you know you've got 30 minutes before the bread goes in the oven. So you want to preheat your oven at this point. I know 30 minutes is a long time, and you want to set the oven to 425. At the same time, you have two options. You can bake your bread on a baking tray, or your 2 loaves if you split it, just on the baking tray that you've set it on, or if you've got an enamel pot, when you're preheating your oven, put that enamel pot, so an oven-proof heavy metal pot, into the oven to heat. So it's an oven within your oven. And this is a common practice now. I know you've probably seen lots of these videos. It really is a great home trick to create a beautiful convection that holds in the moisture in the bread to develop the best crust and a nice even baking, even if you have a bit of a wonky oven. It's an oven within an oven. So what I've got here, I'll put my mat down and an extra towel, just so I don't melt my countertop. I've got my well-heated pot, and I'm going to drop in the bread into the pot. And now, before you put the lid on the pot, you have a couple of options. You need to score the bread. So in the baker's world, we have these tools. It's called a lamb. This is a straight blade, and this is a curved blade. And it's essentially just a thin razor blade, just used exclusively for this one task of scoring the bread. Let me bring this back. And you want to cut into the bread, so when the bread expands, you're controlling its direction, where it's going to kind of split open and bake. If you don't do this, it could happen at the side of the bread or in an unappetizing way. If you don't have a lamb, you can use just a paring knife, make sure it's really sharp, or if it has a serration, a really small serration, because you don't want to tear through the bread, you want to cut through it as cleanly as possible. Okay, so now the lid goes back on the pot, because the moisture from this bread as it cooks is actually going to help build the crust. In commercial kitchens, you quite often have ovens that have steam injection. And so early in the cooking process, the oven produces steam, and that's what helps build the crust on your bread when you're baking, 15, 20 loaves at once. Well, a home oven doesn't have that function, and that is really what that enamel pot, in addition to increased heat in close contact with the bread, it's the steam from the bread itself as it's cooking away that develops that beautiful crust. So it's in the oven for 30 minutes with the lid on, then you take the lid off and you let it cook an additional 30 minutes. If you're baking with just a straight pan, what I like to do is put a dusting of whole wheat flour on top, slash the bread, and in the oven it goes. It still takes an hour to bake. The only difference is if you've cut this dough into 2 loaves, then it bakes for 50 minutes, so about 10 minutes left. Then, when it comes out of the oven, so at this point, we've hit that 3.5 hour mark, or not even that, your bread comes out of the oven, you tip it from the pot onto a cooling rack, and this is the hardest part of the recipe, waiting. You don't want to slice a loaf of bread directly from the oven, because everything is still soft and the molecules are moving around inside it, and you'll actually crush that beautiful structure you've built into the bread if you slice it hot from the oven. So wait for 20 to 30 minutes if you can, and then you can slice. So it's still warm. It'll still melt your butter. And this is cooled enough, I can handle it. But look at that gorgeous crust you get from the pot. And you can see here, this is where I scored the bread before it went into the oven. So I controlled where it split. It's proofed beautifully. You can tell when bread is overproofed because it stays kind of flat. It doesn't grow when it bakes. If you fear you've overproofed your bread, meaning you've let it rise for too long, with either stage, either the first or the second stage, what you can do is repeat what I did for shaping the bread. Knock out the air again, shape it, reshape it, give it that 30 minutes, and then pick it up from there. So there is a way to rescue it. If you've let it go for 5-6 hours, well, then you're looking at more of a project and you have to add more yeast to it. But if you've let it go an extra half an hour or so, there's always a way to fix it. Listen to that crust. And typically, if you add milk to a dough, you don't expect too much of a crust, but because I have a combination of milk and water, the milk means I get a nice crust, but it's not too thick. Some sourdough crust can be really thick, but this is nice and thin. You can see that where the whole wheat flour and oats, the oats have cooked into the dough, so you're not actually aware of them as little pieces of grain. That's why I soaked it first. Oh, I just love this bread recipe. This is just screaming for a nice big piece of cheddar cheese, old cheddar cheese with it. Gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous. Still warm. Beautiful, delicate crumb structure. So this loaf, you're not looking for those big, airy holes. You want something that's a little more dense. This makes the best toast the next day. It is fantastic for sandwiches. If you're making a big pot of soup or stew or chili, this is the bread to make to serve a long time. Think about it. How long does it take to make a stew or a chili? About 3.5 hours. So get your chili going, get a loaf of bread going, and everybody, especially yourself, will be happy. Because baking bread by hand is one of those most gratifying tasks. Oh, that's so good. It's not complex, but you've got full flavor between the oats and the whole wheat flour, a gorgeous texture, and I know you can make this recipe. I can't wait for you to get in the kitchen, give this bread recipe a try, and let me know your results below on the comments. I thank you for joining me, and I'll see you again for another delicious bake-along recipe. Where's the butter?